Timothy Breen tonight to talk about his recent book, The Will of the People, The Revolutionary Birth of America. I just want to give a little background on Professor Breen. He is the James Marsh Professor at Large at the University of Vermont and the founding director of the Shabraha Center for Historical Studies at Northwestern University. From 1985 to 2013, he was the William Smith Mason Professor of American History at Northwestern. He's also taught at the California Institute of Technology, the University of Chicago, Yale University, and held a professorship at the Library of Congress. Professor Breen earned his PhD in history from Yale University in 1968. He is the recipient of numerous eve of revolution, to the role of objects in shaping early American community on the age and the eve of revolution, and to the mobilization of Americans for revolution in the earliest stages of armed conflict that became the American Revolutionary War. This recent book, The Will of the People, The Revolutionary Birth of America, which was published this year in 2019, seeks to answer, I think, two fundamental questions that have long vexed scholars of the American Revolution. First, where did the unlikely revolution the nation through the successful establishment of new governments without devolving into anarchy or autocratic tyranny? Breen answers these questions, I think, with two pioneering insights that have guided much of his work throughout his distinguished career. First, that individuals and groups that made up the revolutionary movement made decisions not entirely based on either ideals or self-interest, but through the more complex web of values, emotional responses to events, assumptions about the way the world worked, causation, mortality, authority, what we call culture. Second, that to sustain a movement and create a community, there needed to be some kind of common experience or behavior that gave members a sense of belonging and purpose. Breen's book while controlling many revolutionary excesses. I'll say in addition that Professor Breen is a master of what we really try to do here at the Museum of the American Revolution, which is by helping us understand our own times, by providing a useful past with points of reference that select on meaningful and resonant themes to our contemporary struggles. So, in the midst of the beginning of the Iraq War and President Bush's desire for us to have Breen writes The Marketplace of Revolution, a book about the forming effects of objects and consumption on community and nationhood. In 2010, and the later stages of the American surge in Iraq, his book, American Insurgents, looked at the early mobilization of the American Revolution through the language of insurgency, of course, important concept for contemporary military writers. And here he's helping us understand, I think, a crucial idea for our times, which is how discourse and how organization happened in the revolution. One of the most potentially acrimonious and truly violent epochs in our history, but yet produced something productive. It's one of the great honors of this museum that Professor Breen reviewed us for the New York Review of Books, and that such a master of letting the past speak to the present and vice versa described this museum as presenting an American Revolution for our times. And I think you'll hear more of how that's done tonight. Professor Breen.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you for the people that run this museum. They do a very good job. I went to a new exhibit about Irish participation. Timothy Breen is an Irish name. I was really eager to see it, and it's a very, very professional thing. I would say that Phil is the first person that dared say my name is Timothy. It is, but I taught at Oxford a number of years ago, and all the dons, all the famous professors, they only went by their initials. You know, if you've been to England, you know that some of them have 3 or 4 initials. And I was a young Scot. I thought, well, that's what successful guys do. They have initials. So I began to write as T.H. Breen. And once you do that, and once librarians catalog your books, you never change. You are T.H. Breen. But before I get into my lecture, I want to say that one of the most poignant moments I had, I was here at the opening of the museum, a huge ceremony right out in front. Some of you were probably here. And then I went on and wrote a long review of the museum in the New York Review of Books, which you can get, and it's laudatory. I really, really think this museum and a couple of others are at the forefront of interpretation in a way that reaches or has the potential of reaching a larger audience. So I took this picture in a moment of boredom. I'm sorry, there were a lot of speeches that day. And I, over my shoulder, saw these 3 people in a building that I think is now torn down. Not invited, just watching, celebrating America, celebrating the American Revolution, and it just made me think that's what it's all about, a sense of diversity and commitment and, shall we say, decent, honorable patriotism in that. So that's one of my favorite photographs that I have in my collection, but that captures for me what the Museum of the American Revolution is all about. So I'm going to tell you about a wonderful super book you must all read and buy multiple copies, leather, Morocco, half-calf editions, called The Will of the People, The Revolutionary Birth of America. This study was inspired by a curious question that may strike most of you as students of the Revolution as so self-evident that it should be summarily dismissed. And the question is straightforward. Where did the American Revolution take place? I repeat, where did the American Revolution take place? Well, one obvious answer, as many historians have done, is that it took place in the minds of an extraordinary group of gifted people that we call the Founding Fathers. And so this interpretation of the Revolution turns it into an intellectual event. It took place in the conversations about great books and great ideas. Or you might say, no, Breen, that's not, we don't do that anymore. It took place in the battlefields, in the Continental Army, and the sacrifice of the soldiers. But I don't think that will wash, because if you follow the military history of the Revolution, it's mostly defeats and retreats, and not exactly something that would hold the whole story together. You might even say the American Revolution took place in the halls of the Continental Congress, but that too is a non-starter, since they met irregularly and didn't do much when they did. So however important these sites may have been, none of them quite answers my question: where did the revolution take place? They don't explain how Americans mobilized resistance to Great Britain, a contest that they had little prospect of winning. We sometimes forget that Britain was the most powerful military force that the world had ever seen since the fall of Rome. And then over 8 years of war, despite many military setbacks, the American revolutionaries managed to sustain a powerful commitment to independence, sustain over years of sacrifice. And so the answer to my question about the where of the American Revolution is in small communities, villages, hamlets, crossroads, from New Hampshire to Georgia, where ordinary Americans over dinner at church, at the market, explained, justified, and then reaffirmed the creation of a bold new political order. These were the sites where they dealt with fear. They worried about betrayal. They wrestled with thoughts of revenge against other Americans. This is where they made huge personal sacrifices, an economic sacrifice for what they imagined was a common cause. So I put it to you that these are topics: fear, betrayal, sacrifice, revenge, that one encounters. We can encounter it regularly in the story of other revolutions. In the French Revolution, the Haitian, the Russian, the Irish Revolution, an emotional grouping. But somehow our revolution, the American Revolution, seems to have been stripped of the very elements that we associate with other major revolutions in modern times. Committees of revolutionary enforcement, the contagion of fear, the administration of revolutionary justice, and the rise to power of an extraordinary, a huge number of new people who flood into positions of power who had never had power before. So what is gone from the story we tell ourselves about our own revolution, it seems to me, is the experience of ordinary Americans who, during the war, took control of the resistance to Great Britain. Now, let me just stress at the beginning of this presentation that what I'm going to tell you and what I try to tell you in the book is not a marginal story. It's not a mere footnote. For without so many committed Americans in tens of thousands of small communities, we would not have achieved independence. It is they, it is perhaps us, not the founding fathers, who are the indispensable actors in the creation of the new republic. And so what I tried to do is, Phil so articulately mentioned, what I tried to do is not describe specific battles or moments like the Declaration of Independence, but rather a range of emotional reactions that seemed to me, from my study of France and Russia and other revolutions, the possibilities of living through a revolution. And so the chapter headings alone will tell you what I was up to. The sense of rejection, being pushed out of the empire. The need for assurance, because in fact, when you fight a revolution, it's violent. You have to be so sure of yourself that you risk your life or kill someone else. It's not something that is taken lightly. There's a contagion of fear, a need for revolutionary justice, a sense of betrayal in your own midst, a sense of revenge after the war is winding down and you look at neighbors who may have mistreated you. And finally, accommodation that brings the country back and restores something we call a union. Emotional phases that define how people react. So tonight, I'm going to concentrate. Why is that? These things have a life of their own. Hello. No, come on. Hello. There, we're going to come back. I don't know how that happened. I'm going to concentrate on a phase of the revolution that might be defined as a sense of betrayal. And these are the years of the revolution of 1778 and 1779, not years most of us ever study in school. But it was in this period that the nation's prospects were extremely grave. The reports from the battlefields were not encouraging, and the untested enthusiasm that had bubbled forward in 1775, maybe in 1776, had definitely cooled. And the greatest threat to sustaining resistance, and that's the goal, was the collapse of the economy. The country was experiencing crushing inflation. The cost of basic goods and labor rose often month by month in three-digit calculations. As you all know from reading your newspapers or watching your television, inflation of this sort can and has destabilized many countries. It's a serious business. Think of the history of Argentina or Germany in the 1920s. So it is not an exaggeration to say that it was at this moment that the revolution, our revolution, hung in the balance. We all know the sort of, I think, funny line, but it wasn't funny for the Americans. Not worth a Continental. The money is worthless. In 1779, one newspaper writer drew attention to the sudden and rapid fall of our currency, which is the very soul of our political existence. The government can't create economic stability. Why fight for it? The Continental Congress begged the American people to honor the currency, even though it was a near worthless badge of patriotism, but the appeal had almost no effect on ordinary men and women throughout America who could no longer afford basic foodstuffs, just simply getting through your day. And then there was the problem of paying soldiers who were actually doing the fighting. They had wages, they had contractual relations, and it was at this moment that ordinary Americans did something very unexpected, and that is, even though they were suffering, they did not blame the Continental Congress. What did they do in this situation? They looked, as many Americans do and have, they looked for the evil or the people that were causing problems much closer to home. As prices rose precipitously from month to month, Americans ask increasingly, who is responsible for the economic crisis? Who is it that's betraying our revolution? Give us names of the people that are undermining the cause. And the distressing answer throughout the colonies, the states now, was that other Americans, neighbors, people one knew who had supported, or at least rhetorically, independence, but who were now more interested in advancing their personal wealth than in sustaining the fight against Great Britain. As the Reverend Wright, and I draw quotations from the period, observed, it seems as if our rich men, like so many hard millstones, had got the poor people between them and had agreed to grind them to death. How lamentable it is to hear a poor woman with half a dozen small children whose husband's in the army complaining that she cannot procure a shirt for a poor, half-frozen child? Whether this is exaggeration or not is not the point. There was a sense that the enemy was amongst us. It was other Americans. From Williamsburg, Virginia, came the claim that a new spirit of extortion, which was hatched in the obscure corners among the selfish, the disaffected, the most despicable of human creatures, has spread like a low mist throughout our land. This is not the spirit of 76. This is a different cultural environment. And that low mist spread north. It spread to New England, to Newburyport, where one minister explained to his parishioners, "We are striving. Who shall best improve his private interest and make the most money, although it be endangering and perhaps at this moment destructive to our country and to all our valuable liberties." And one has a sense of this possible betrayal when you look into the town notes, town meeting notes. They're wonderful. They're written down in Worcester, Massachusetts. You can look at it yourself. But when you do there, you say in 1779, the town committee, and this is really ordinary people, farmers, after we have survived 4 years of war and have been more successful than could have been expected, to become prey of monopolizers and other devils of no principles, but to raise themselves on the ruins of our country is intolerable. If we suffer such proceedings any longer, our existence as a people is at an end. That's a tremendous claim. The very fabric of the revolution is coming undone. Now, I apologize tonight to burden you with so many quotations, but I wanted to make the point that most historians ignore this period. They leap very athletically from the Declaration of Independence to the end of the war, perhaps the peace treaty, but they really, really want to get to the Constitution, which they see as the end product of the whole revolutionary experience, and they ignore what I'm talking to you tonight is the existential crisis of sustaining the revolutionary cause. If what I'm going to talk to you tonight about had not occurred, there would have been no Constitution, and there might not have been any country. What was the problem was profiteers, speculators that threatened independence. Farmers in America said that the urban merchants were looking for sharp deals, driving up the prices, and the merchants in Boston and in Philadelphia accused the farmers of holding back crops, holding back livestock needed in the cities in order to make more money. But whoever was to blame, the major crime of 1778 and 1779 was extortion. That's the word you see all the time in the newspapers, extortion. The practice, self-serving practice of putting personal gain above the common good. In a word, charging what the market would bear rather than caring for the needs of your fellow citizens or the suffering poor. And so it comes as no surprise that the leading minister of Massachusetts in 1779, William Gordon, advised Americans, if men in this day will not be content with their livelihood and selfishly make themselves fortunes, immense fortunes, out of the distress of the people, I say, let the curse of heaven fall upon their substance and their unhallowed gains. Now, the most dramatic evidence that I have found as a historian came as a surprise to me. It's a little play, or at least it calls itself a play or a comedy, published in the town of Danvers, Massachusetts, by a struggling printer named Ezekiel Russell. Whether he wrote or merely published the play, I cannot find, but the published version has this wordy but quite alarming title: The Downfall of Justice and the Farmer Just Returned from Church Meeting on Thanksgiving Day, a comedy lately enacted in Connecticut. Well, I assure you, ladies and gentlemen, whatever it is, it's not a comedy. Rather, in graphic form, in cartoon form, Russell offered an emotional critique to the spread of extortion in America. In published form, the play is illustrated with a series of little woodcut cartoons. They were very expensive to make, so that Russell's pouring his livelihood into this play. Now let's see if we can. There. Now, there are only 2 editions of this play that have survived in America. This one comes from the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, and they specially rephotographed it for you, but it's still a mess. But you see, it's the downfall of justice and whatnot. What you can't see, and I will tell you about, is up here is a poor mother, and down here is her little child. And the little child is saying, "Mama, Mama, I want some bread." And so the play asks, Americans ask, who is responsible for the child's suffering? And the answer is a local farmer who is growing very rich by exploiting his poorer neighbors. And so we see in this play a self-satisfied family sitting down appropriately at this season for a Thanksgiving feast. And they stuff themselves. Indeed, the farmer, we are told, has to undo his belt in the middle of the meal because he's had so much pudding. And that someone over dinner says rhetorically, pity the poor. Now, you just have to take my word, but there's an extortionate family sitting around just feeling very good about themselves. And in the picture over here, Mama, you can just barely see, she's working on the stove. She's making a pudding. And at this point in the play, Sarah, the farmer's complacent daughter, observes of the holiday pudding. The town folks would now be glad even to have a crust of the pudding. I expect some of them along tomorrow, Mama, or the next day, begging, as the Indians used to do on the day after Thanksgiving. I can't laugh how foolish our neighbors will look. One of the beggars might just be the mother who can't feed her child, just like the Indians used to do, but we don't know where they've gone. Presumably they are gone. This is the stuff, obviously, a real comedy. The whole point of this marketplace, from the family's perspective, is to obtain the best possible price. And as for the losers, we can pity their lamentable situation. We discover that the farmer is an unapologetic extortioner. Here is a conclave of extortioners. I hope you prepared for this. You can identify this guy, Satan. And what is he saying? He's looking out at these guys who are trying to get the best price. I shall have a fine haul among these fellows. And these guys hold back needed farm products. In other words, they won't sell to the needy in the anticipation that the price will go up. But curiously, in this play, I was so fortunate to find there's a moral voice in the downfall of justice, and it is unexpectedly a black slave named Jack. And in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner, Jack can stand his master's sanctimonious twaddle no more. He knows an extortionist when he sees it. And he exclaims, he can't control himself, poor Jack. Well, master, I don't think it's a fair thing when poor folks can't get something in their belly. And directly turning to the master's or the farmer's greed, Jack says, Master, got rye enough? Wheat enough? Cider enough? Everything enough? And he concludes this daring, you can imagine, courageous commentary. Jack has pity on the poor folk. Jack has pity on the poor folk. But the members of the family do not. The suffering of their neighbors who are going to come begging after Thanksgiving is not their concern. For them, private property is private property, and you can do with it what you want without opposite intervention. That's how the law works. That's how the economy works. And the master's wife turns on Jack, describing him here in the most vulgar, racist language. Comedy. You black bastard, I do wish Jack would mind his own business and not talking about things that don't concern him at all. And so we might ask from this extraordinary surviving document, for whom did Jack speak? How far could the extortioners push their agenda before meeting a resistance? Or maybe in another word, what are the limits of revolutionary commitment to patriotism? Well, the answer that the play gives is alarming. As one character announces in menacing fashion, I will ask the question, will your army continue to defend you in the field when their wives and children are famishing and crying for bread at home, through your intolerable oppression, or will they turn their arms against you and do themselves justice? Up here, we have American soldiers who are waiting for pay, worried about their families at home. Not the normal story of revolution, is it? So you might ask, how did the American people respond to this financial threat? How did they channel their anger? We know that they had faced British troops. They'd done a good job. They faced Tories. But now the problem was neighbors who had placed personal wealth before patriotic duty. And in these circumstances, we ask, how do you sustain revolution? Over and over throughout the country, one heard the same complaint. The honest and truly industrious part of the community has been made the victims of the avarice and the unpunished villainy of these wretches, their neighbors. Now, this is the moment when the revolution could have fallen apart. You might have said, well, George was pretty bad, but not maybe that bad. I mean, maybe we could rethink this whole thing. Certainly the British thought that might occur. But it did not happen. It did not happen. Community after community decided that local people, the people, could and should police the profiteers, monitor the speculators, punish the extortioners. It was the people's duty to bring forth economic justice. Now, some of you are pretty astute economists in this audience, more than I, but you might wonder at such economic naivete. How could a single village or town, no matter how determined, speak effectively to the hyperinflation that had undermined a national, perhaps even an Atlantic economy? It's not going to work. But that did not stop the American people from trying, from setting prices, from setting wages, of enforcing economic justice in little towns like Danvers, Massachusetts. Who did it? In town after town, committees of safety and observation, groups that had mobilized at the start of the war, reformed, came forward once again. These groups were the public face of our revolution. Where did it take place? In Danvers, in Worcester, in Hartford. As one Philadelphia writer explained, we hold with this maxim that where the offense is publicly dangerous and the law is unable to punish, the community, in its own defense and for the further security, has the right to expel these profiteers. And another Philadelphia committee, I thought you'd like some local stuff here. We conceive the remedy to the economic crisis can be no other than the discretionary power of the citizens organized and acting through an elected committee. Indeed, the efforts to form a just economy took on an almost evangelical character. Communities, once again, as they had been in 1774 and 5 and 6, once again became genuine revolutionary sites. In 1779, a Connecticut committee in Hartford proclaimed its determination by the blessing of Providence and the united efforts of our fellow countrymen to rescue ourselves, to rescue our country, our posterity from poverty, misery, and destruction. Little towns were going to bring economic justice, and the driving assumption behind these actions was the belief that the people, us, acting as responsible citizens, had every right to express their opinions in this way about the state of the economy. As a general meeting in Boston insisted in 1779, it is the right of a free people to inquire into all public and private grievances and seek the proper mode of redress. And the call went out. In the South, in Williamsburg, committees were formed. A New Jersey Revolutionary Committee warned, if any person or persons within our jurisdiction of this committee shall either give or receive more for their merchandise, produce, and labor than is fixed by this committee, and being therefore duly convicted, they shall be held up to the public in a manner adequate to their offense. Now, what the American people found in the moment is enforcement like this is hard work. You all have been in committees, probably in your church, maybe in your town. They're really boring. You know, people repeat what the other... I was an academic. I know what boring meetings are. And yet the American people in town after town sat long hours into the night, setting labor prices, wage and good prices. You know, you can imagine, you know, it's after a hard day on the farm. And you say, do you remember what nails cost in 1773? I'm not sure. Was it as much as cloth? As a New Jersey committee found it to be necessary that the said committees inform themselves as minutely as possible of the current prices of all things. Woo. And if the causes of different prices of the same articles in different places are a problem, they need to be settled to fight the spirit of extortion. Now, there were bound to be disputes. One man's memory of the price of this or that changed, but it did not dull the enthusiasm at hand. I'm going to show you some documents here quickly, just to show you that I might know what I'm talking about. All right, let's go. These are the price lists that the various towns, this is Ipswich, came, and they published these after great debate. And you can see, everything. Turkeys, East India toddy, veal. You can imagine what a burden it was to sit there. And this is, whereas by the act of the General Assembly, for preventing monopoly and oppression, that the selectmen and the Committee of Correspondence, they really went to work on this. And let me go back. And this is Salem, Massachusetts. My favorite, and you can imagine the fight that this was, someone says, well, what are we going to do about the price of pallbearers? You say, okay. You have 4 guys carrying the casket. So somebody says, well, what if it's a child? It's not that heavy. So that probably should be less, right? And they're sitting around, so they set the price of funerals based on the anticipation of the weight of the corpse. In these towns, Newbury, Salem, Ipswich, Williamsburg, they not only went through the details, but they published their records. And alas, within months it was apparent that the will of the people was not sufficient to curtail those who stubbornly defined patriotism as self-advancement. The challenge did turn out to be bigger than a village. Regions tried to respond, states tried to respond, but they found that, as we always do in our lives, that cheaters get around regulations. You don't like the Salem gravediggers? Try the next town, maybe you'll get a better deal. And people who condemned extortion were reluctant to name names. People who did these things, the Worcester Committee found enforcement very difficult because the offender might be an acquaintance, an intimate friend, a neighbor, a relation, or a gentleman who we are loath to offend. The enemy is us. And of course, some desperate people, like hungry mothers, bought at high prices, paid the high prices, knowing it was wrong, but just simply trying to get through their days. Americans in 1780 bought and sold what they needed, perhaps embarrassed, hoping to avoid censure, and grumbling that the revolution may have been an opportunity to amass personal wealth. But that's not the big point here. It would be wrong for you to leave tonight or read my marvelous book thinking that all of this was a failure. The effort to regulate a struggling economy may, in fact, have saved the revolution, saved us. After all, the campaign for economic justice gave new life to all those revolutionary committees, bringing thousands of new people into the revolution, into the public forum, to set prices, to set wages, to discuss in these long meetings the very meaning of economic justice. This burst of activity sparked new faith in a political culture anchored in the will of the people. It was the people that were wrestling with the meaning of their own revolution. And so what we encounter in community, in a community-focused story of the Revolution, one that redirects our attention away from the Founding Fathers, is a huge number of ordinary Americans who spoke up, who protested special privilege, who served on committees that gathered price and wage information. That's true. They may have been unable to control inflation or save the continental currency, but their activism, their confidence that the will of the people mattered, helped sustain the revolution at a moment when the victory seemed very uncertain. The story of the revolutionary people reminds us at this day that participation of this sort should not be taken for granted. Civil society demands that citizens give public voice to their most pressing concerns, to an appeal for justice. That is exactly what Americans did at key moments in the development of a new political culture, our culture, the one we revere, the will of the people. They spoke up for the common good and condemned the claims of special privilege. That is really our revolutionary heritage. And we today owe as much to a founding people as we do to a few founding fathers. Thank you. Yes, I will. I accept fulsome praise, compliments.
Questions from the audience? Sure.
Yeah, you better come up with something.
All right. I'm told to stand on the sax so that I can be seen.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I'm wondering to what extent you think there was actual widespread extortion versus that becoming a assumption of a lot of people, but there being lots of other factors for price inflation.
So the question is, when they point their finger, the Americans point their finger at a neighbor and said, you're doing bad by us, is it, how much of this is going on? The answer is that's a very difficult to ascertain, Phil. There certainly was some, because these committees did name names, and they published people in their town who, my favorite is the infamous cheese merchant of Worcester. He and his wife.
Still makes me mad.
Yeah, it does make me mad too. She sold cheese at a high price. But it may have been just simply the pressures of war and the difficulty of sustaining imports that was a natural way to, in other words, some of the merchants may have been blamed for extortion when in fact they were just simply responding to normal supply and demand. I understand. But the big point, again, I make, is whatever the reality of the economy is that ordinary people took it upon themselves to deal with it. And that's really a remarkable element of our revolution. And all the chapters show in different phases of the revolution how people did come forward and define revolutionary justice, or how they responded to fear in the first years of war. Now, there is a problem that Phil didn't ask because he's a nice man, and you're not raising your hands. And that is, there's a tension that I became aware of in writing this book, and I fear probably never resolved. And that is, what is the relationship between good citizens bringing justice to a community and vigilantism. It's a fine line that when certain groups take it upon themselves to enforce their will on other citizens. And at the time, there were a number of people that were aware that this was a potential issue. And the response was always, okay, it may be that sometimes citizens groups get out of hand, but we're in the middle of the revolution. We got to beat the British. This is not a time to worry about niceties of that sort. In other words, they just put it on the side burner and said, I'll see you when we have a peace treaty. There's a question.
You mentioned that these councils and local committees had limited impact. What ultimately led to the reduction in hyperinflation? Was it the end of the war?
Yeah, so the question, if you hadn't heard, what solved the problem that the people couldn't solve? And part of it was Congress stopped printing worthless money. So one of in a sense, one of the engines of hyperinflation was removed. The other was, as the war came to an end, increasingly the various states took over financing the revolution, not the federal government. And what many states did, it's a very complicated mechanism. They allowed people to pay their taxes with this semi-worthless paper in order to just get it out of circulation. So by the 1781, there were a lot of problems. In fact, the next chapter, as you'll find when you buy several copies, is revenge. All right, so we've solved that problem. But the big issue, and I say it not with a sense of living today, but the end of our war was the first great refugee crisis in American history. Because all those Tories and loyalists said, look, war's over, coming home now, want my farm back. And most of these little committees in town said, I don't think so. So the question is, and this is, I'll leave you with this, one of the most remarkable things, one of the remarkable attributes of our revolution is we figured out how to end it. Most revolutions don't end very nicely. They lead to coups, counter-coups, instability for generations. But when our revolution was over, it was kind of more or less over. And how the American people pulled it off, I'll leave to you. Thank you.
Steve.
At the time of this revolution, there was no what we refer to as social media. What would be the impact, particularly when you look at things like are going on in Hong Kong now, of social media and the instantaneous transmission of information and the proliferation of communication on a revolutionary movement or a revolutionary moment?
So the question is, one of the issues about mobilization in a revolution, any revolution, and then sustain it, is the sense of solidarity. In other words, no town and no group wants to be cut out and be, oh, we're going to have a revolution in Danvers, and then 7 other New England towns say, well, sorry, have a good day. I mean, there has to be a sense that the society is with you. You have support. And I've argued in other publications, not this, that the social media, the new form of information in town, was newspapers. I really believe that without the press, the revolution would not have been able to be carried off, because Americans in New England read about these people that they had never seen in South Carolina and Virginia who were doing what they were doing. And it gave a sense of a momentum to the cause as it went along. So throughout the whole story of the revolution, this exchange of public information is key. It would be really hard for me to imagine the revolution having occurred, say, in 1730 or 1740. There simply wasn't the infrastructure of information necessary to pull it off. Okay?
One more question. Do we have time? Yeah. All right. Last question. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. In a previous lecture that we heard last year, there was some discussion of cottage industries arising and bartering amongst communities. Did you see evidence of that happening in some of these communities?
Yes, the question is about, it's separate, cottage industry, I mean, you know, mostly cloth.
Cloth?
Yeah, because the Americans, during the revolution, they tried to make things that they used to buy from Britain, and it was almost always a failure. Glass, for instance, metal work and whatnot. So it was basically some cloth. There's some, but most Americans before, during, and after the revolution do what all of us in this room do. They went to Walmarts, and they bought cloth and then they made it into garments. That's a different thing. But the raw materials are purchased. This is a capitalist exchange economy. And while there are some notebooks that historians have found where in farm communities there'd be a shorthand accounting such as in exchange for my boy working on your farm for 3 days, you'll give me a pig. You know, in other words, they're turning labor into a currency amount. That happened, but that is unusual. There's just no getting around that. America in the late 18th century was already a pretty advanced capitalist economy.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Professor Breen.